Good afternoon, and welcome to session C6, Policy Matters, ASFPM as an Advocate. I am Chad Berginnis, Executive Director, the Association of State Floodplain Managers, and I have the honor of serving as your moderator today for this session. And this session is something that really just talks to my heart in terms of a lot of my work at ASFPM over the last couple decades. And that's really our policy function at ASFPM. And so we have three members of our national policy team that's going to be speaking on different aspects of policy advocacy. Now, because these are interrelated type presentations, we are going to go through all three presentations and then do a Q&A with the entire team at the end. But please don't let that stop you from entering questions into the platform so that we can have a good set of questions ready to go for all of us. So with that, let's begin with our first presentation. Our first presentation, How the Sausage is Made, ASFPM's work to help shape federal policy, regulations, and program implementation. And our first presenter is Merrie Inderfurth. Merrie has served as Washington liaison for the Association of State Floodplain Managers for more than 25 years. In this capacity, she helps association leaders to keep informed about policy and legislative developments of interest and importance to the association. Merrie has been involved for years in working with Congress, including being a former staff person for Congresswoman Lindy Boggs of New Orleans, Louisiana. And Congresswoman Boggs was particularly active in supporting the development of the National Flood Insurance Program and served on the House Appropriations Subcommittee, which funded FEMA and the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development. Merrie has a bachelor's from Brown University and a master's of public administration from George Washington University. So Merrie, take it away.
Hi, I'm Merrie Inderfurth, and this morning, or this afternoon, excuse me, we're going to be talking about ASFPM's role in advocacy in terms of policies and programs. One of the important things that you probably wonder about is who at ASFPM plays a role in advocacy work. Well, there are a number of us, and one is the ASFPM policy team, which is Chad Berginnis, Executive Director, Larry Larson, Director Emeritus, Meg Galloway, who is Senior Policy Advisor, and David Conrad, who is Water Resources Policy Advisor, and me, and I'm the Washington liaison person for ASFPM. Additionally, we have the ASFPM policy and technical committees who get involved very often in providing the kind of policy and technical expertise that we need to back up statements that we're wanting to make, and the committees often participate in preparing comments and so on. The ASFPM Flood Science Center also provides scientific background and data as needed, and those experts are brought into conversations oftentimes. Additionally, the various state chapters, 37 state chapters covering, I think, 41 states. And state chapters are great because even though state and local officials are members of the chapters themselves have a lot more flexibility about being able to engage and make policy recommendations or program comments. ASFPM members in general, oftentimes there are either comment periods or there's a hearing scheduled on the Hill. Anybody who wants to submit comments, letters, can certainly do so, and oftentimes do. You'll hear later from Meg about ASFPM Engage, and that provides an avenue for members to become directly involved. There's also partner groups that we work with that where oftentimes we'll all collaborate on a particular issue that we would like to raise the radar on. So then additionally, as we're talking about all of this, we'll talk about advocacy access points. We'll talk about what is advocacy actually. And we also talk about some useful tips and concepts related to this. And then a couple of quick examples of ways in which ASFPM has played a role. So in terms of access points, a big one, of course, is legislation. And that would be legislation in the Congress particularly, but also at the state legislature level. There again, Meg will talk more about that because we've more recently begun to follow some legislation at the state level. And that's another access point that's important. When we're talking about legislation, you want to be involved at a number of different kinds of levels, partially as the legislation is being developed, tossing ideas to policymakers and assisting them as needed where they are trying to flesh out ideas and so on. Oftentimes there will be draft legislation. And when there's draft legislation, again, sometimes they will come directly to ASFPM and ask for comments. Other times they'll just, for example, on the NFIP reauthorization legislation that's in the House right now, it's been released as draft legislation, and anybody is certainly free to comment on it and provide comments. ASFPM has prepared a long list of policy priorities, which we have shared with the House and Senate committees looking at NFIP reauthorization. And then amendments. There are amendments when a bill is, has been developed, it's been introduced, and then it goes to a markup in committee. And at that time, committee members can introduce amendments. Sometimes they are helpful amendments, and sometimes maybe they're not very well informed amendments. And that's when you get into almost like playing the game of whack-a-mole, like trying to find out about what are these amendments that could be problematic and then trying to explain why they could be problematic. And then hearings take place, and ASFPM is often asked to provide testimony for hearings. And additionally, even if not asked, you can always submit written testimony for hearings. And that particularly often occurs with appropriations, because appropriations committees, subcommittees, all hear from their agency officials who are wanting to hear them justify their budget requests, but they don't hear from the general public. And so what they have is outside witness deadlines for submitting testimony. And ASFPM usually does submit outside witness testimony for some of the appropriations subcommittees. Importantly there, you want to become a resource for the committee members and the committee staff so that they will come to us on that. Regulation, in terms of the federal agencies, rulemaking, usually there always is a public comment period. And there again, the committee, ASFPM policy and technical committees play a big role there in terms of submitting detailed commentary on proposed rulemaking and other kinds of relationships with federal departments and agencies. That you want to be able to bring program and policy problems to the attention of federal or state or local officials. You want to participate where we're available in advisory groups. And you want to, again, in that instance too, establish relationships so that you can be a sounding board or a resource for them. Now, getting to the question of what actually is advocacy. Well, advocacy is a very key element of the policy and governance process, as you can tell. Essentially, it involves education about policy and program needs, about recommendations for improvements, about sharing of practitioner expertise. That's really important. and bringing research and data to the table that others might not be aware of. Most of what ASFPM does constitutes that kind of education/advocacy. Oftentimes the question comes up, what's the difference between advocacy and lobbying? There's some specific rules that govern lobbying, but by and large, any 501c3 organization that doesn't spend more than 20% of its budget, I believe, on lobbying activities or political contributions or things of that nature, it's fine to engage in advocacy. So ASFPM has never run into that as a problem. And so that's just important to clarify, because the question does come up. But really, the bottom line here is, what would policy and governance be without advocacy? You'd be making policy in a vacuum. You'd be in an ivory tower with no ground truthing going on. And none of us want to see that in terms of our policies and programs. So I would give a little example of my time working on Capitol Hill for 17 years, 15 of which were for former Congresswoman Lindy Boggs, who was very active on all the flood kinds of issues. But just as an example, I had a huge portfolio of, any congressional staff does. I think there's, on the House side, the limit is only like, I think it's 13 staff, and that covers both in DC and in the district offices at home. Senators have a larger staff, but me working on a House staff, for example, I handled all of FEMA, including appropriations for FEMA, except the black budget, which is the continuity of government. Anything dealing with flood insurance, dealing with housing issues, small business issues, banking issues, veterans affairs, women's issues. I'm probably leaving out some. She was on the caucus for women's issues. I was her liaison to that entity. And also on the side, foreign policy, not defense policy, but a foreign policy. But the workday involves, meeting with visitors from the district, meeting with advocacy groups that come in, meeting with lobbyists, attending hearings, preparing questions for hearings. When the boss is going to be going to a hearing, you need to do the preparation work and prepare a set of questions that the boss will or will not use, but you need to prepare it. And then writing speeches on anything that has to do with any of the topics you're responsible for, responding to any correspondence that comes in on any of the topics you handle, following committee, House floor activities. So there's a lot that goes on. I'm trying to paint a picture here of a busy staff person who is not as engaged as you are in the direct knowledge of the programs you work with. So how would I, sitting in an office on Capitol Hill, know what works, what doesn't work, where a policy change or modification could be helpful, what ideas might be worth exploring for possible legislation, what new background information would be helpful in evaluating proposed legislation. I've been working with ASFPM elected leaders, committee leaders, and policy team for some 25 years now. And it's very obvious to me what a great value this is to members of Congress and senators to hear from home and to know how things resonate back at home and what the problems are, how things are working. The value of there's an obvious receptiveness to this kind of expertise, background, so on. Later in the presentation and in the next two presentations, you'll hear some stories about the value of these kind of contributions. Moving on to some useful tips and concepts. We have, I think it's very important to consider the context in which the policymaker is functioning. Is it somebody in local government, state government elected? Are they appointed? Are they staff? Remember, most do not have anywhere near your knowledge and level of expertise in these immediate program and policy areas. So what you want to do is to make contact with them and educate in a manner that is appropriate to the recipient's level of knowledge. Try to figure out where they're starting from on this discussion. Do they need a 101, or can you start at a different level in terms of the conversation? You want to develop a relationship as best you can and keep in touch with people where appropriate, not to be a nuisance of any kind, but become a resource so they trust you and want your thoughts if they're dealing with an issue that comes across their desk. You also want to pay attention to the questions that they might ask you. Sometimes those questions become the basis for you deciding to develop a fact sheet or talking points, or actually to lead to research that could be done to support your policy points. You want to provide very important to provide those boots on the ground reports of what works, what doesn't work, what needs improvement. And this is really essential to the formulation and implementation of good public policy. An important element of this is timing. Because people are extremely busy, to get attention to your issue, you want to time your contact as much as you can to some upcoming opportunity for action by the policymaker. Is this something they're going to have to be dealing with sometime soon? Because then they're going to be able to pay a lot more attention to what you have to say. You want to also prepare ahead of time your ideas and recommended actions so that you can present them, you're ready to present them at an opportune time. Do your homework so you can present a fair picture of what is likely, where is likely support for this idea going to come from, and also where might opposition come from. You want to provide also counterpoints to any anticipated opposition to what you're proposing. Persistence, another big point. Understand that policy and legislative initiatives often take time to gel. So you really have to be patient and not give up. You don't want to get discouraged. Look for what Larry Larson likes to call WOOs, windows of opportunity. Remember that circumstances do shift around. Education and understanding of issues grows. But conversely, you also have to realize that there's frequent turnover of staff and officials. And so the need for education and advocacy is ongoing. Where possible, you want to work on an issue from a variety of angles. You want to talk to agency folks. You want to talk to people in the legislative branch. You want to talk to even the Office of Management and Budget in some instances. And also partner organizations to fill them in on what your thoughts are and get their collaboration if they are interested. So working with other stakeholders and organizations will also help to show broad interest and support. So I think that moving to an example that's kind of interesting is it has to do with funding for flood risk mapping. And over the years, we became aware that it was very difficult for FEMA to plan their mapping agenda because budgets are handled on a year-to-year basis, and they would fluctuate dramatically from year to year, how much the agency would get to support the mapping activities. And this was really hindering getting the mapping more of the country and with better accuracy, and doing the underlying hydrology and hydraulic studies that are necessary, so on and so forth. So basically about a dozen organizations came together to learn about this problem. The group, we called ourselves the Flood Map Coalition, and included were associations that included local and state elected officials. For example, National Association of Counties, League of Cities, Conference of Mayors, lender and insurance associations, American Bankers Association, mortgage bankers, Emergency management organizations, NEMA, the state emergency management directors, development and planning associations, housing organizations, including National Association of Realtors and the Home Builders. We had meetings usually hosted by the National Association of Realtors or NACO. They alternated holding our meetings in their nice conference rooms. And we would have guest speakers come from FEMA, from congressional committees, from academia and research entities and others. So we would do coalition letters, contacts with FEMA, Office of Management and Budget, and congressional committees, both authorizing and appropriations. Influential members of the House and Senate, we stressed the value of getting the maps right and getting more of the nation mapped, because every member of Congress was hearing from their constituents about problems with flood maps, as I'm sure you realize. So the result, especially talking with OMB, was very, very responsive. And they can't commit to a specific level of funding, but they did commit to an informal agreement that they would fund a 5-year effort at updating the nation's flood maps at $200 million a year, which would be called map modernization. Well, as you know, that took place between 2003 and 2009, roughly. After that, of course, that was just step one. So we still had a long way to go. And so it's not the end of the story. There's been an ongoing need for education. And in fact, we had questions, lots of questions were, okay, so we did map modernization. So now what? Aren't we done? Well, the answer was no. And there we went to the Flood Science Center and to assemble a group of experts in flood mapping. And specifically, the appropriations committees were asking us, so how do we really understand? We're not really getting what we need from FEMA about what are the remaining mapping needs and how much is it going to cost? So ASFPM produced a report in 2013 called Map Modernization for the Nation, or Flood Map, excuse me, Flood Mapping for the Nation, it was called. Subsequently, those same committees were saying, hey, we need an update. So ASFPM produced an update in early 2020 of flood mapping for the nation. And we continue to meet. We had a hiatus there with the Flood Map Coalition, but we've been more recently meeting again, and we'll be preparing a letter of request for mapping funding this year, reflecting some of the needs shown in the Flood Mapping for the Nation report. This was clearly, very importantly, over the years, a lot of the administration budget requests have really been low, and congressional appropriations have significantly exceeded those budget requests. Not what we need yet, but they have exceeded those budget requests, which really shows the ongoing positive results of persistent education and advocacy, explaining, answering questions, and so on. So this is an ongoing effort, but it has been a successful one. And very quickly, because I'm running out of time, I will just mention as a couple of examples of agency advocacy is where we've had to speak up for the perspective of floodplain management. One example is at FEMA a couple of years ago, there was a decision reached that they didn't want to show the coastal barrier COBRA districts on the FEMA flood maps because they didn't want FEMA to be responsible for data produced by another federal agency. Well, ASFPM pointed out that this was really a problem for a local floodplain manager if you're doing permitting and so on, not to be able to see where the COBRA zones are on your flood map. So eventually, FEMA was very receptive, understood the problem from the floodplain management standpoint, and now that data is reflected in the National Flood Hazard Layer. And in fact, it's being looked to as an example for incorporation of other kinds of data from other federal agencies. And then another quick example is another ongoing issue, which is the problem that has come up with FEMA updating all of their digital information. And turns out that it was really designed for the insurance side of the program. They hadn't really focused on the fact that making it more difficult, really, because of the Privacy Act concerns coming out of the Department of Homeland Security. They were limiting access to claims information, repetitive loss property information, and so on, making it much more difficult for local floodplain managers to gain access to this information that's needed for them to do their jobs. So again, ASFPM needed to speak up for the floodplain management side of the program and call attention to that issue. It's still being worked out, but there's receptiveness there at FEMA understanding the problem, and it was important that ASFPM could raise the issue, and hopefully we'll see some successful resolution. So that's the end of my part of the presentation, and look forward to the next two presentations.
Thank you, Merrie, for that great presentation. For our next presentation, Grassroots Advocacy to Federal Legislation, the Atlas 14 story, we have David Conrad. Since March of 2017, David has served as the Water Resources Policy Advisor to the Association of State Floodplain Managers, advising and representing ASFPM on a wide variety of policy and legislative issues, including the National Flood Insurance Program, Stafford Act, and flood-related programs of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. He served previously for 23 years as the National Wildlife Federation's Senior Water Resource Policy Specialist and has written extensively on flood and floodplain management policy, including serving as project manager and principal author of the National Wildlife Federation's landmark Higher Ground Report in 1998, which brought national attention to problems with the repetitive flood losses and highlighted new non-structural programs. David received a Bachelor of Arts in Environmental Sciences from the University of Virginia in 1974. And before I turn it over to David, I just wanted to remind everybody, again, if you have any questions, please use the panel to submit those so that we can have a great Q&A. And with that, I will turn it over to David.
Good afternoon. Again, I'm David Conrad, the Association's Water Resources Policy Advisor, working with Merrie Inderfurth here in Washington, D.C., where for more than 40 years now, I've worked to help my friends and colleagues, both as individuals and through conservation and professional organizations, learn and navigate effective advocacy and public education to bring the best ideas of wise water and floodplain management to the public, media, and to policymakers, including our legislators in Congress. I totally love this work, and I've seen so many positive outcomes from passionate, informed volunteers and working professionals who are helping to bring about real change as our nation lumbers its way to making better natural resource and water management decisions. So our panel, Policy Matters, is really hoping to encourage floodplain managers from all of our disciplines to become comfortable and effective at being advocates in many forums. You all have special skills and training and insights that are absolutely essential to making better communities and societies locally, regionally, and nationally. First, I'll just talk a little about lobbying, which has a few rules you should probably be aware of regarding tax law, especially if you do it from a tax-exempt organization platform. But the vast bulk of good advocacy is just free speech and unencumbered public education, which is a right, and we should say, even a responsibility of all good citizens. While technically lobbying is advocacy, it's only a very narrow slice of it. And I'll comment on its importance from a couple of aspects. After that, I'll talk a bit, basically as an example, about a very current and immediate public policy issue, which for the past couple of years, we've been working on, updating and modernizing the NOAA Atlas 14's extreme precipitation frequency volumes across the nation, and how ASFPM came to focus on these concerns originally. However, on the advocacy questions, as professionals and active public citizens, it used to be that some could be a little intimidated on questions of what is or is not lobbying. Is it okay? Do I know enough to get involved? How can I be confident at it? No question, we want to encourage you to be an advocate for good policies for managing floodplains and to spread your knowledge freely to others, including policymakers who guide our society and need your expertise to do their leadership jobs. Back when I first began working with environmental groups as a water resources policy advocate, helping our members get involved was a big need and personal focus. I started as the first legislative representative of the new group American Rivers, and later with Friends of the Earth. And after that, I worked for 23 years with the National Wildlife Federation on water resources policy, all the time in part to help our grassroots and state affiliates, mostly volunteers, become both good students of environmental and public policy issues, and then active advocates for the best solutions we all could find. We would encourage our colleagues certainly to write letters and talk to the media, and if at some point it was needed, come either to Washington or go to their state capitals to communicate with their national or state legislators and do some lobbying, either directly with legislators or their staffs or through other public appeals. But Congress in 1976 had clarified that for nonprofit charitable organizations who don't engage in partisan political action, called 501c3s in the IRS parlance, are not only just allowed to do some lobbying, but they are invited and encouraged to do so within some limits of their total organizational, charitable, and educational expenditures to make their expertise available. The rest of advocacy, beyond the narrow IRS definition of lobbying, is basically personal or organizational communication to your legislators, media, or general public education, or a charitable activity on basic issues or concerns. It's kind of what you're expected to do as a good citizen and active member of your community and society who has relevant education and information that is needed by society to function better and hopefully well. Also, the internet revolution since the 1970s has brought down the costs of sharing information so much that for small organizations, it is practically no serious cost at all. But for organizations that contemplate spending considerable sums beyond insubstantial levels, it would be a reasonable point to check with your tax counsel to be sure. Lastly, I'll point to some good web resources available on advocacy generally and lobbying. There is a group called the Alliance for Justice, a DC-based, progressively oriented nonprofit with offices in several cities and great web resources, who have developed guides and pamphlets, fact sheets, working with many of the biggest charitable and educational foundations in the nation that have sought to strengthen the reach of charitable and educational nonprofits advocacy, and their staffs can also give webinars on public interest advocacy if interested. And certainly our ASFPM staff, board, and volunteer policy committees can also be helpful to you on your advocacy efforts as well. Meg Galloway in the next segment will talk about ASFPM's new Engage initiative that can help take us further into easier collective work on key issues for our floodplain management community. So I want to quickly move to describe ASFPM's recent work on the Atlas 14 issue, particularly as a good example of how what may become national issues often start and evolve. They often start from a local or regional perspective, and then sometimes can be nationalized as policy issues if the problems are commonly shared. As you all know, ASFPM has long had a vital interest in the huge undertaking of NFIP floodplain mapping, which is a basic foundation of good floodplain management, planning, and insurance. Well, we all recall in the last 5 days of August in 2017, Hurricane Harvey, making 3 different landfalls, poured record amounts of rain with 30 to 50 inches falling over large areas of greater Houston and southeast Texas, then further east, doing a record estimated $125 billion in damages. The Houston Chronicle reported a total of 154,000 homes flooded, many outside the mapped 500-year floodplain. It damaged roads, bridges, utilities, and hobbled the region's transportation network, and damaged or destroyed 50 to 100,000 cars and other vehicles. The community of Nederland, Texas, near Beaumont, had a record 60.58 inches of rain over about 5 days. The storm came in off the Gulf of Mexico and essentially stalled and hovered, utterly thrashing the region with precipitation. The nation's attention was focused for months and now years, trying to help the region back on its feet and to understand what happened. In late February 2018, I was asked to come to a 2-day conference at Houston's Rice University, mainly to hear the region's scientists, engineers, environmental experts, and politicians discussing what they knew 5 months after Harvey. And then I was asked to give a short response at the end, maybe to reflect on national flood policy with a Washington, D.C. perspective. Professors Phil Bedient and Jim Blackburn at Rice University were very generous with their time, and Professor Sam Brody from Texas A&M was also super helpful in getting me oriented. Beforehand, I had also met with Harris County Flood Control District experts to get their views and toured several areas. In my summary, I'm pretty sure I didn't say anything truly profound. I was mostly shocked at the damages. But one thing that caught my attention was some preliminary findings from the NOAA National Weather Service team that was working to complete an update of the Texas Atlas 14 Volume 11. They were saying, after adding the new precipitation numbers reflecting several large storms in recent years that had hit the region, Tropical Storm Allison in 2001, and especially the 2015 Memorial Day storm, where more than a third of flooded buildings were outside the designated 500-year floodplain. And the 2016 Tax Day storm, where more than 55% were outside, and others, the Atlas 14's 1% chance 24-hour precipitation event was likely to be increased 38% from 13 inches to 18 inches over a considerable area. That was shocking because it implied how out of date and erroneous these basic engineering and planning extreme precipitation frequency documents were. The NOAA report was officially issued 7 months later in September of 2018. Going back to Washington, we continued to explore this issue and found that other than for Texas, most of the rest of the regional Atlas 14s were a decade or more out of date, some nearly 2 decades. and the 5 Pacific Northwest states had not been updated for nearly 50 years. These would be relatively inexpensive to update, considering how critical they are for floodplain mapping and infrastructure location and designing, but this had not happened because NOAA had adopted a policy at some point to only ask for donations from states and local agencies to pay for them, and the increasingly strapped state and local governments couldn't find the money, and these documents were becoming seriously obsolete as changing climate seemed to be increasing precipitation. Over time, we explored this with state floodplain managers in the Northwest, Mid-Atlantic, and New England and Southern states, which just raised our alarm. And we began to raise these deficiencies in ASFPM briefings, publications, our outreach to partner organizations such as the National Flood Alliance, the American Society of Civil Engineers, and the Association of Dam Safety Officials, among others. Then in February of 2020, the House Science, Space, and Technology Committee held a key hearing where FEMA, NOAA, and ASFPM were invited to testify on a panel on NFIP floodplain mapping. And Chad Berginnis pointedly raised these concerns and got strong public responses from FEMA and NOAA in the hearing that they too were very much concerned. After a lot of continuing dialogue through the summer, in August of 2020, the Senate Commerce Committee Chairman Roger Wicker, Republican of Mississippi, and a member of the committee, Senator Gary Peters, Democrat of Michigan, introduced a bill, S-4462, called the Floods Act. A key section would provide NOAA the authorization to spend $3.5 million per year from federal funds over the next 10 years to update and create a national precipitation frequency atlas to be updated at least every 10 years or more often at the discretion of NOAA's administrator. The bill was reported surprisingly quickly from the committee to the full Senate in September and passed the Senate in November. ASFPM posted a notice of this on our Engage website, which helped keep some attention on the issue. Then on December 4th, Chairwoman Mickey Sherrill from New Jersey of the Senate House Science Committee, Environment Subcommittee, introduced an almost identical Floods Act, strongly supported by ASFPM, and another bill for updating Atlas 14s, as well as creating an improved system for calculating probable maximum precipitation estimates, PMPs, especially needed for dam and levee safety. A strong push was made to clear the Senate-passed Floods Act in the House before the close of the 116th Congress at year's end. And the bill was basically cleared by the key House committees, but it did not get finally passed for lack of time. Since then, in the new Congress, very similar bills have been reintroduced in both the House and Senate. And the Senate Commerce Committee, again, 2 weeks ago, reported out its Floods Act S-558. It was helpful that the Washington Post 2 weeks before ran a strong story explaining the grave implications of having seriously out-of-date Atlas 14s. The Senate bill is now being readied for consideration by the full Senate with ASFPM's strong support. Both reintroduced House bills, H.R. 1438, the Floods Act, and H.R. 1437, the Precip Act, had a positive hearing on April 21st, for which ASFPM provided support, and we believe they could be considered soon for at least some level of activity by the House Science Committee. There is also a chance that funding may be possible to start the Atlas 14 updates even sooner with general authorities NOAA currently has to get updates started in the coming fiscal year 22. In conclusion, once again, this was kind of a quick run through, but time and again, advocacy seems mostly to begin with local events that teach us lessons that then need to be studied by citizens and experts alike, then discussed in wider and wider circles in the media, and then can eventually be brought to Congress if legislative assistance is appropriate and the public is sufficiently vocal and involved. We are optimistic that some important progress can be made this year on improving the nation's precipitation frequency atlas tools. And if it happens, it will be partly because of a substantial collective effort of the nation's floodplain management community.
Thank you, David. You know, Atlas 14 is one of those initiatives that really illustrates, I think, the power of floodplain managers and our collective experience in terms of policy making in that process. So really appreciate the insights and the story that you told there. Again, I know this is the last session of the day, and so folks may be a little bit tired, but I want to encourage you to provide any questions you have in the questions panel while we go ahead and move on to our third presentation. And actually, I'm really excited about this presentation from the standpoint, I think what Merrie and David talked about are some of our advocacy work that we've long been known for at ASFPM, really working on federal legislation and federal policy. But I suspect that there's a lot of you tuning in today that are also concerned about state and local legislative initiatives. And I'm so excited because here at ASFPM over the last couple of years have increased our capacity to do and to help out with a lot more of that work. So our last presentation today is tackling state and local issues and tools to help effective advocacy. And our presenter is another member of our policy team, Meg Galloway. And Meg joined the Association of State Floodplain Managers in 2019 as a senior policy advisor. Her entire career has been focused on water resources management and public safety issues, primarily in the areas of floodplains and dams. Prior to joining ASFPM, Ms. Galloway spent 7 years consulting and then 29 years with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, the last 10 years managing floodplain management, floodplain mapping, and dam safety programs. She earned her Bachelor of Science in Civil and Environmental Engineering from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and is a registered professional engineer in the state of Wisconsin. So, Meg, take it away.
Okay, this will be the start of the presentation. Welcome to the third presentation in the Policy Matters session. Here we'll hope you learn about the work ASFPM does as an advocate, but we also really hope it will provide you the information you need to start becoming an advocate if you don't already do so. My 1.5 years on the policy team at ASFPM has really opened my eyes to the importance of advocacy and the many components of advocacy. There were 2 other presentations in this session. The first, How the Sausage is Made, was presented by Merrie Inderfurth based on her many years of experience working for the federal legislature. The second, Grassroots Advocacy, was presented by David Conrad, and it tells the Atlas 14 story from grassroots post-Harvey effort up to a bill that has now been introduced in the Senate. My part of the presentation will focus on state and local advocacy, but we'll start off with a brief explanation of what is advocacy and why it's important, then move into you as the advocate, talk about the assistance that ASF can provide in this area, and some advocacy tools. What is advocacy? Most important thing to remember is while all lobbying is advocacy, not all advocacy is lobbying. And in another way to put it is in the realm of what ASFPM does and what the realm of what you probably do, either personally or within the context of your job, is education, education, education. Why do I say that? Because lobbying is very specific. It has 3 components, and you need all 3 components in order for it to be considered lobbying. The first is communicating with decision makers. The second is talking about existing or potential legislation. And the third is urging a vote for or against the legislation. And all 3 components need to be available if it's to be considered lobbying. And the lobbying is only focused on elected officials and their staff. It is not lobbying if you do this to the executive, judicial, or administrative body. Again, the majority of the work that ASFPM does is education and discussion with legislators, the administration, or agencies. It is not in the realm of lobbying. So why is advocacy important? Well, if it's about education, our federal governments, our state governments, and our local governments have to understand the issues that are important to us, whether it be the executive branch, the legislative branch, or the agencies in each of those levels of government. Go on. So you as an advocate, as an individual citizen, you have every right to talk to anyone about an issue that is important to you. However, you do need to temper that right with the fact that you are probably someone's employee, and there may be constraints put on your advocacy work as it associates with your employee. I worked for the state of Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources for 30 years. In that 30 years, depending upon the views of the governor's office, the legislature, and the management of the Department of Natural Resources, I had different constraints or encouragement to do advocacy work. Many times I was encouraged to go over to the legislature and talk to the legislators themselves or their staff, or talk to the governor's staff. And of course, we did a lot of work with other state agencies and communities that was in the realm of advocacy. However, as administrations changed, so did the amount of work I was allowed to do. For a period of time, we were not allowed to go talk to legislators unless it was approved and basically the legislator asked us to come over. We were not allowed to comment or provide information on a bill as it would pertain to our programs. And at one point, we were not even allowed to go to local jurisdictional meetings like a Board of Adjustment meeting to talk about a zoning decision. Another realm of you as an advocate is that you are a professional, and as a professional, you can provide accurate information, dispel myths, and provide compelling examples. That's one of the best reasons why you should become an advocate if it's allowed by your employer. Another realm of advocacy is partners. ASFPM works very closely with a wide variety of partners on our advocacy work. Sometimes we're working with just one other 401c3 type organization to talk about an area of interest. We are also involved in several coalitions of like-minded entities that band together to analyze, assess information, just to discuss courses of action, and often write joint letters to agencies or to legislators. Some of those include the Flood Policy Alliance, which really focuses on floodplain management and the nexus of environmental work with floodplain work and mitigation activities. Another is the Flood Map Coalition, which is primarily focused on issues related to floodplain mapping. And the Digital Coast Coalition, which was very, very important in the recent passing of the Digital Coast Act at the end of last year. As chapters, ASFPM chapters can be great advocates. In the case, one case in Arizona, the chapter was very effective at advocating on new floodplain legislation and really was instrumental in helping pass some very beneficial legislation. In Indiana, the chapter just worked very hard to try to oppose a wetland bill that would definitely have a negative impact on floodplain management and on essentially flood risk reduction by having taken away certain classes of wetlands out of regulation. However, it's very important as a chapter that the chapter is on the same page as far as what policies they feel comfortable commenting on and what policies they don't. And so this is very important that the board and the membership, and if there's a legislative committee, work ahead of time to have some policies and procedure on how a chapter might advocate. In Wisconsin, the chapter 2 years ago advocated on 2 bills, one which was pretty straightforward, that the chapter was in favor of advocating against a bill that was changing the floodplain management regulation. The other one was about a grant program, and there were different attitudes about how the proposal in the legislation would affect different member types within the organization, be they working in the private sector, in the public sector, and their interests in different types of mitigation. Next, I want to just spend some time on advocacy tools. ASFPM, one of our biggest advocacy tools is our policy team. In Madison, we have Chad Berginis, the executive director, Larry Larson, senior policy advisor and emeritus executive director, and myself as a senior policy advisor. In Washington, D.C., we have Merrie Inderfurth, who is the our Washington, D.C. coordinator, and David Conrad, who is our senior water resources policy advisor. A year ago, ASFPM launched ASFPM Engage, which is a new tool we have that can help us educate more easily on bills that are before legislators. And there's a component of the tool that helps us set up campaigns where we can encourage people to comment directly about our regulation, to write a letter to a legislature or to the administration, or allow us to collect your stories about a particular issue. But before we go to that, I want to talk about Advocacy Toolbox. ASFPM is in the process of working on our toolbox. it's not done. And so right now I suggest that American Planning Association has an excellent advocacy toolbox that walks you through some basic advocacy efforts that can be done at the federal, state, and local level. One is legislative fly-in. That's going, whether it's going out to DC or going to your state legislature or your local administrative body, going to them and talking to them. If you do have interest in going out to DC and talking to your representatives, Merrie Inderfurth can be very helpful in giving you recommendations on how to do it. Another is to visit your legislator within their district, a back home visit. It's a much easier way to try to get some time with your legislator. And their toolkits have ways to request, set up, and conduct the meetings, send sample thank you letters. The last is it's a field visit. One of the best ways that people learn is by doing, and getting people out into your world to see the work that you do can tell a very compelling story. Next, I'm just going to walk you through ASFPM Engage. From the Policy and Advocacy tool, when you open that up, ASFPM is one of the links available. And when you get into the page, you can see that we have a section on federal legislation, and these are all the bills that have been introduced in this 117th Congress that we are very interested in. There is state legislation, and right now you can see 3 bills, but if you go down to the next button and push it, there are 2 more bills, and we have been doing a lot of work with states in recent months. What can we do for states? We have helped chapter and agency people read through legislation and get ideas on the potential consequences of the legislation, or when there might have been similar attempts to pass legislation in other states, and provide information on that. We have also testified before legislative committees, and in the case of Utah, we recently set up a letter campaign that requested the governor pass, that the governor veto a piece of legislation that had passed the legislature that had the potential to put all the NFI, all the communities in the state at risk of not being eligible for participation in the NFIP. Then the last thing we have on the bill side, a place where we're collecting NFIP reform bills, because there have already been several introduced, and we expect more to be introduced as the 117th Congress moves forward. The right side of the page is the ASFPM Engage side, and you see it says engage on an issue, and then there is an action. When you look at an actual campaign, there is an action button. In this case, it is write a letter. So if you press that, you come to this page. Actually, before we go through an engage campaign, I'm going to show you what happens when you push one of the bill buttons. And you get some information, the bill number, the name of the bill, when it was introduced. At the bottom, if the information is available, you get information on the sponsors, the co-sponsors, and the latest actions. We cannot put a bill on Engage if it does not have a bill number and it's not put up on the website for the legislative body. Then there's a description. The legislature website usually provides a description, but it's often not as descriptive as we would like it to be. So we usually add additional information in the description area. We can state our position on a bill, either support it, oppose it, or indicate we are still analyzing the bill. And then there's a commentary section where we can provide a little bit of background on why we're taking the position we are for the bill. Now we can go over, and when you push on the Write a Letter campaign, you come to this screen with information, a brief introduction to the issue, and then a place where you can put in your information. I will warn you, you do need to put in a prefix. You cannot leave that field blank. And once you've put in your information, if you want this information to be available the next time you do an engagement, click Remember Me. And there's also a option to opt into any emails that we would send out from the Engage site, though we to date have been tending to send out emails notifying of engagement to members and other people on our mailing list in a different manner. Once you're all done, you hit the Submit button, and you get to this section, a new page that has a lot more detailed information about the bill, the background of the bill, and why we think this letter is important, and then some information that will help you decide whether to write the letter and decide what to put in the letter. If you continue to scroll down, you get to the actual letter portion where you will see who the letter is going to. In this case, the letter is to the state, to the federal senators for each state. So being from Wisconsin, these are my senators. There's a drop-down box where we can provide additional instructions on how to work through this letter. And in this case, we provided some talking points. So when you got to the section where you could add your own information, these were things that we thought you might want to use. Anywhere you see a box with a white background, this is where you can add your information. In the case of the subject, we pre-add some subjects, and we add a number so that if multiple constituents write to a recipient, they don't all have the same subject line. However, you can put your own message in there. Beneath that is the front end of the letter we have written that provides the background on why the information is, why the letter is being written and what we're urging them to do. You can see another white box here. This has been set up for you to be the place where you can add that very important information about why this issue is important to you, to your employer, to the job that you do, to the community that you live in. You'll notice that we have given a starting sentence to this paragraph. If you choose not to write anything and just send a letter, this will work. If you choose to delete that, just know that you have to put something in this box, otherwise the system won't let you send the letter. And then there's your closing section, and again, it's pre-filled, but if you want to change any of that information, you can. And finally, you submit. After you submit, you'll get if everything worked right, you'll get a confirmation. And then ultimately, you'll also get a thank you email from Chad. One thing I will say about this is, in my experience, it's taken between 5 and 30 minutes for that email to come through in our email system. Another thing to note is that when you look in your email, after you sent it, we've had a few people who have actually gotten a mailer demon notice that it could not go through. Both times it happened, it was when we were in our test environment rather than our production environment. But if it happens to you when you're in our production environment, I ask that you contact me right away so I can work with our vendor to work through the problem. you will not see the letter that that goes out to your recipient. So this is one that I got because when I'm testing it, I send it to myself. So I thought I'd show it to you. Just know that you will not see this. You may or may not get a notification of receipt from your recipient. Some of them have automatic notifications once they get an email, some don't. And then ultimately you may or may not get a reply to the content of your letter from your recipient. So with that, I'm at the end of my presentation. I was excited to be able to present this information. If you did not get a chance to listen to the first two presentations in the session, I recommend listening to them when the conference recordings are available online. And please call me if you think I can help you on any issue, be it federal, state, local, be it legislation, be it policy or program implementation. The ASFPM policy team really wants to be a very good resource for you. So again, thank you for attending, and now will be the time for question and answer.
All right, thank you very much, Meg, for that walkthrough with ASFPM Engage. All right, now it is time for the question and answer session. And again, I will encourage you to type questions in on the platform so that we can see them and we can ask them. And actually, I have a couple of questions that I developed myself, but it looks like Kathy is asking one that is quite similar to one that I was going to ask Meg. But then also, if any of the other team wants to add to the answer, that's fine. Kathy's asking, at what point should entities try to engage ASFPM? And kind of what I wrote up in my head is kind of a scenario like, help, I've just found out my state's proposing a crazy new law that's going to make it hard for me to do good floodplain management. What should I do and who should I engage? And so, Meg, maybe if you'll kind of tackle that first, and then also let's make sure we're answering Kathy's question, at what point should they try to actually engage us?
I think the first, some of this is going to depend upon what Kathy's position is, whether she's working for a state agency, whether she has more leeway with her employment. If she would be with a state agency, I think she probably needs to first start out with her management chain to see their reaction and what's willing to go on, or what they're willing to have her do. I mean, there's going over and talking to the legislator. That's very often when it was approved by my management, that's what we started, where we started was going over and talking to the legislator, trying to find out what was behind the legislation. Was this an isolated incident that they're trying to fix one small problem with a sledgehammer? So that's where to go, maybe immediately if you're with an agency. Beyond that, if your state has a chapter, that's a very good place to also go and talk to them. Many of the chapters have legislative committees, and it can be brought to the legislative committee and give some time. The earlier you reach out in one of these circumstances, the better. Some of the situations we've had this year, the legislation has moved very quickly, and there wasn't a lot of chance, and we're almost at the 12th hour with committee hearings before people had much chance to react. I think you can engage ASFPM staff at any time. Early in the process, we might be able to send you towards other people who may have had similar circumstances. If it really gets to if it's closer to the point where you need us for legal research, perhaps to testify, or we have recently written some letters. You can do that. Right now, I'm sort of being our clearinghouse for state issues, so that contacting me at meg@floods.org is the best way to reach me.
Great. And I would just add that you could reach out. Certainly Meg is running point on that, but if you know of any of our policy team and just want to reach out, because I think as Meg was saying, with ASFPM Engage in particular, we can get something at a minimum up on our bill tracker, at least at the state and the federal level, so that we can at least raise awareness that the piece of legislation is out there. So Merrie or David, any other commentary on that particular question, or I'll move to a couple others.
I think that Meg gave a really good example of the various access points that we talked about earlier in my presentation. And there are a number of them, and it also does depend on where you're coming from and who you're representing. So I think that was very effectively clarified.
Okay. David, this next question's for you. What are the prospects of a national Atlas 14 program passing this year? And, if I'm an individual here listening to this presentation, is there anything I can do to help this effort?
Well, I think the prospects are pretty good, because it matches a lot of what Congress is and the administration, the new administration, is talking about. They are recognizing that first of all, there's a lot of talk about improvements in infrastructure, and that may mean a lot of almost any scenario that I can think of is going to mean a considerable uptick in the spending on infrastructure. And that includes transportation, roads, bridges, water treatment systems, stormwater systems. There's a national movement to try to make some investments in those areas. Well, we need the basic data to size and design and to right size and design those kinds of systems. And we need to and our planning departments and in local communities need that kind of information too. So I think that is why Congress has been kind of moving fairly quickly and got fairly close to passing something at the end of in December, and why the Senate Commerce Committee reported out a bill literally last month. And the other thing is that and this is one of the issues that we in Washington kind of have to watch, is where will it move? Does it move as an individual piece of legislation, or does it get attached to a bigger package, they call them, that's doing sort of a broader theme and go there? For individuals, though, the most important thing to do, I think, is to, if you think this is important, help relate the importance to your local members of Congress and your local leaders, even right down to the city and county levels. That if we had better information, we could do a better job. And we don't have good information right now because the whole system of funding those Atlas 14s has pretty much failed for the last decade to get them updated. And in a number of communities, I think we're beginning to see a rather disturbing change in the patterns of extreme precipitation. And we want our scientists to be on top of that. And the best way to get there would be for NOAA to have the funding problem. And it's not that much money. I mean, we're just looking at what's the data say, and keeping it up to date instead of being 40 years, 20 years behind. And then there will be, I think, a need to continue to study if there are ways to look a little into the future, maybe based on data that many scientists are working on statistical ways to look into the future so that you could at least inform our infrastructure community and maybe our floodplain management community on designing for longer time. Okay. So getting in touch, using your expertise and making that relationship, building that relationship as an ongoing dialogue, that'll help.
So David, I'm sorry, go ahead, Merrie.
I was just going to chime in to say that in terms of an individual, I think also going to your state chapter and getting the state chapter engaged, because right now we do have a bill that's been reported out of Senate committee. It's a great opportunity to make sure that the chapter contacts the local, not only the members of the House, but also the members of the Senate in this particular case, to say this is really a good bill, it's really important, and we really hope it'll move because this precipitation data is obviously increasingly important. We're having more and more extreme rainfall events. We've got to get on top of this if we're going to make effective investments of federal funds. I think it's very opportune time to do that kind of thing. And then on the House side, additionally, they've got those two bills introduced. And again, the same thing on the House side could be to get your House members to encourage in this case, it's the Science, Space, and Technology Committee to move that bill out of committee and get it going. So those would be two things. I would also point out that one thing I missed hearing in David's presentation, and maybe I just missed it, but was that prior to this, you see the funding for Atlas 14 has just been hit or miss. It's basically been up to states and localities to try to kick in and update their data. So what's happening here is really that the congressional committees picked up on the research that ASFPM has done to realize that actually this is an appropriate federal responsibility to pay for this. So those are just a couple of thoughts.
Okay, and if I could maybe to pick up, and again, this could be a bit of homework if you're so inclined to do. If you go on to ASFPM Engage from our website, and again, it's under the Policy and Advocacy tab, you can first find the relevant bills in the bill tracker. And I believe it's the Floods Act in both the House and the Senate. Also, on that same page as the bill tracker and the engagement, one of the things that you'll find if you scroll to the very bottom of that is a lookup function to find your elected officials. And so all you need to do is put in your personal zip code if you want to, and you can get your both your federal and your state elected officials, including senators, representatives at both levels. And it also gives contact phone numbers. And seriously, one of the things whenever we do a lot of the advocacy on the Hill, we hear time and again, it's really important to hear from folks back home. So again, this is one of those things that, if you're willing and able to do, maybe use some of these new tools that we have and go ahead and weigh in on the creation of a National Atlas 14 program. Okay.
And I'll just add that the advocacy, the bill sponsors always are happy to have co-sponsors of their bills. So that's also something that could be suggested if it made sense.
Right. So Kristen, new question has come in from Kristen. Can ASFPM communicate information about proposed legislation like this to state chapters to encourage this local involvement? Kristen, I think that's a great idea. And if you or anybody has maybe some approaches that you think would work, we would definitely be open to them. It's kind of like having a new car that you're tinkering around with under the hood. We know that there's a lot of potential with this tool, and quite honestly, I think we're all kind of trying to unlock the capacity and figure these things out. Meg, does somebody want to talk about our national policy briefing as a vehicle that way?
Well, it certainly occurred to me that we have a national policy briefing just about monthly. The members are certainly of ASFPM are invited to get on, this team will do about a 30-minute briefing on sort of the hottest topics. And if someone from a chapter or many people from a chapter want to call into those calls, I think just getting in touch with our state chapter coordinator. Actually, I have to ask Chad who would be the best contact to get in touch with, but those are a good place to keep somewhat on top of timing.
Yeah.
I think Kevin Curry on the staff usually sends out a notice about those policy briefings, and we've had pretty good participation. So I think that is a good way to stay current. We also have the legislative report in the Insider. That's every 2 months, though. So the monthly reports are good for keeping up with what's hot at the moment, as David said.
And both of those things are member benefits. Those are things we do to help our members keep engaged.
Right.
And maybe to close that out, one of the other things we will do, and I think Meg talked about this a bit, is that we will create even some custom engagements where we can proactively reach out then to the entire membership when we've heard that it is strategically important for people to weigh in on an issue. Because, it's kind of funny. Advocacy is both offensive and defensive. And I kind of recall where, there are certain points and times that you want to weigh in to support something, but then there are times that we have to play defense and try to basically kill a bill if we can, or, a particular provision of legislation. And so, we have to, kind of play both sides there. Merrie, maybe the last question I'll turn to you, kind of in all the experience that you've had, is there really any particular time in terms of it's most effective to do some kind of advocacy effort? Is it better, for example, when a bill is introduced? Is it before, trying to get in on the ground floor to shape it? Is it after, passage by like a chamber of Congress, or is it just dependent on the bill itself?
Well, I mean, the real answer to that is all of those various avenues for engaging with legislation are important. However, probably for individuals and chapters to launch an advocacy effort, as you say, is more when we actually have a bill to talk about, whether it is something that we want to, that the chapter or the individual wants to take a look at the bill, and if they have recommendations for improvement in the bill, if they have criticisms of the bill with an explanation of why, that's probably the most effective moment. And then also marshaling, if you want to support the bill, for example, marshaling support among others within your state chapter, or even if in some cases maybe the state government would be willing to comment too, on supporting and urging movement on that legislation. So I think that's probably the most effective time, although the Atlas 14 example certainly shows where the ground up is important as well. So.
Okay, great, Merrie, great. And a big thank you to the ASFPM policy team panelists that we have here, Merrie Inderfurth, David Conrad, and Meg Galloway for your presentations. And thanks to all of you for hanging with us. I know it's getting to be 6 p.m. Eastern time. And that really does conclude not only this session, but I believe kind of the itinerary for the day. I would encourage folks again, we start back up tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Central Time for concurrent session D. And so with that, thank you so much for participating in day one of the ASFPM National Virtual Conference, and look forward to seeing you back tomorrow for more exciting presentations.